Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Will Spence and Olivia Milburn on Emei's The Unfilial. In this part, we discuss the question of responsibility and the process of translation from Chinese to English. If you haven't yet listened to the first part, I suggest you do that first, and if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of my conversation on The Unfilial by Emei with Olivia Milburn and Will Spence, two of the translators. If you haven't watched or listened to the first part, I do suggest you check that out first. And at the end of that first part, we were talking a little bit about the issue of responsibility. The idea of responsibility is one that both stories address. And maybe, Will, if I turn to you first, there's a sense in some respects that traditional structures are fragmenting, and then the question of who's responsible for what seems to be maybe more up in the air than it would be in a society that's more traditional. Those structures are more fixed. Perhaps that's a little bit simplistic. But what do you think your story, It Runs in the Family, has to say about the nature of responsibility and where responsibility should lie?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it, at this story through the lens of responsibility and what it means to be a responsible member of society or of a family. Because actually, before this discussion, I hadn't really seen it in that way. I thought about it more in terms of the nature of fate and what it means to be resigned to a certain fate, which a lot of the women in this story are. But I think you're right, responsibility is important because as I've just been saying, I think you could certainly argue that a lot of the suffering in this story occurs because individuals fail to acknowledge that their actions have consequences, or that they choose to blame others rather than accept the responsibility. And as I said, it's because of this failure that history keeps repeating itself in the family. Not just individuals, actually. I think there's several examples of institutions, like schools, hospitals, police services, being similarly quick to blame others and unable to accept responsibility. And it's hard to kind of second guess the author's intentions, but I think it's relevant that so again the title of my story got changed in the English translation. So the original Chinese title is actually translated as something like "The Secrets of Genes." Was always the genes as in the kind of genetics.
Yes, it's strange if it's
which I don't think sounds great in English, which I think is why we changed it again. But it does suggest that Emei thinks that there is some kind of link there, some kind of link between the actions of previous generations and the present lives of later generations. So maybe if there is a lesson to take away from the story, not that it necessarily needs a lesson, but it might be that individuals and societies need to take better responsibility for their actions, and if they don't, then consequences kind of get kicked down the line to future generations.
Which is not unrelated to a theme that you see in my story as well, because in Gran is on Her Way, one of the major characters is the gardener at the hospital, and he's part of the ring of baby smugglers, and he talks about his own story to explain why he's made the decision to join the ring. And the point is that he was an abandoned baby and was found really half dead after his parents threw him in the bin, literally. And his adoptive parents were wonderful, but the courts gave him back to his birth parents, who then proceed to neglect him in the way that you would expect of people whose original response to having a child was to throw it away.
Yeah.
To throw him away. And yeah, you know, the kind of trauma and abandonment issues that you're going to have with that kind of background. I mean, he really takes the view that taking these children away from people that don't want them for whatever reason and giving them to people, you know, telling them to people who do, is intrinsically a meritorious action. But you know, you absolutely are not left in any doubt that this man is really seriously troubled.
And I think what's also interesting, you contrast his actions. You know, they work hard to set up the ring and maintain it. You know, so it's a responsibility in the form of, you know, really actively doing something and making it happen, which you can contrast with the idea of abandonment, you know, just to, which I think is similar to the teacher in It Runs in the Family. I think, Will, you know, my initial reading was kind of similar to yours. It sort of seems to suggest there's this fate. It just recurs almost because that's how it is. But, you know, you look at the figure of the teacher who impregnates this young girl, not once, but several times, right? Which is, you know, inexcusable. And it's not a mystery to an adult how this is going to keep happening, but just an utter lack of responsibility to do it. So I think, you know, actions in the case of Gran is on the way that sort of look negative to begin with, you do sort of get a new perspective on them, I think, through the way the stories are told.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important. I didn't really kind of give a sense of that, but you're absolutely right. The kind of like morals are quite blurred in this story, and it's rare that kind of things are presented in black and white, right and wrong terms. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, she's kind of, yeah, if you look at it objectively, it's abhorrent, but like the way that the narrator presents it, it was actually it was a loving relationship. And so you have that kind of, as a reader or as a translator, I guess you have to, well, mostly as a reader, you have to kind of process that yourself and kind of form your own judgments. And
yeah, I think that's a good point about the narrator's voice. I felt more so in that story as well. This sort of apathy and acceptance, if you're not careful as a reader, sort of can transfer to you. Oh yeah, and then actually reread it, it's like, no, that's not okay. You know, so yeah, the narrating voice, I think, is playing with us a little bit, and is part of, I think, the ironic tone you were mentioning earlier, Olivia, as well. Olivia, question for you. So, you know, the collection has the subtitle for Tragic Tales of Modern China. Again, curious to know if this has been added or changed from the original. And maybe you can fill me in on that in a moment. But I mean, the concept and the nature of tragedy in literature changes across time, also in different cultures. You know, Lu Xun, major figure in modern Chinese literature, has his own idea about tragedy. It's maybe not the same as in the West. What do you think makes Yao Emei's work tragic? What is tragedy in her work? Do you think it's a continuation of maybe earlier ideas, or is Yao Emei giving us a new model of tragedy for maybe the 21st century?
Yeah, so with regard to the subtitle, if I remember correctly, this was actually kind of my idea.
Oh, right, okay.
When
so good person to answer.
When we were having the discussion about changing the title, and you know, all the translators got together and with the editors and so on, and we were discussing what to do with this, then the idea of putting in a subtitle did come up, and I think this was mine, or really close to what I suggested have. So yeah, it's all my fault. And tragedy, actually, I think, you know, in Yao Emei's stories, it's always kind of ironic. You have, it's like she has the main story, and then the evil, the tragedy, the real sadness is outside that. because, like in Gran is on her way, the main story is to do with the hospital setting, child, infant abduction ring and human trafficking. But the actual tragedy is this woman's relationship that is tying her to a really terrible man.
Mm.
And I think in Will's story as well, the apathy, I mean, I haven't read your translation, but I read the original Emei book the whole way through. And, you know, the apathy of the main character in that story's voice, the kind of acceptance means that the tragedy is sort of hidden from the reader. It's maybe not so direct. Yao Emei seems to like to present the horror in the interstices of the book, one way or another. I think that's really interesting, and whether that's a kind of new approach, I mean, I'm sure not, but it's interesting, and it's very refreshing for how much it makes the reader work with thinking about, you know, what is actually going on here. That the main story may appear horrific on the surface, but often there's a really good reason why these people are making their decisions. And at the time, it may seem to them that they really don't have any choice, and that the decision that they made is absolutely the best thing that they can possibly be doing in this situation. And the real nastiness is elsewhere.
Will, do you have anything to add on tragedy?
Yeah, I think this isn't really a fully formed thought, but I realized earlier I was talking a lot about fate and how a lot of the characters in the story seem kind of resigned to their fate. And so, I mean, without being an expert in any way, that does seem quite similar to Greek tragedy, where fate is inescapable and any struggle against it is futile. But having said that, I think if there's a tragedy in this story, it's that it shouldn't have to be that way, and that fate isn't inescapable, and there are ways of changing your lot in life. And I think, as I said before, it's not a story of female empowerment. And actually, I think, again, this is maybe projecting slightly, but it seems that the author is critical, because I don't think she's saying that the female characters are incapable of escaping this kind of cycle. It's almost as if they're kind of unwilling, and that they're complicit in I mean, that she maybe not complicit, that's going too far, I think. But I don't think that the message is that fate is inescapable and their lives are kind of mapped out for them from the start. And I think the tragedy is that some of the characters seem to believe that.
Yes,
I think.
Yeah, they're not fighting against. I mean, I suppose maybe for whatever reason, psychological flaw, psychological problem that they're not dealing with, they accept this treatment from the people around them.
And
yeah, I guess. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go on, because I think one might want to say, I'm still thinking about it. It might be quite long, so go for it.
I was just going to say that with the idea of, again, going back again to the idea of responsibility, and that I think the idea that the flaw is almost the flaw in the way that they choose to look at the world, in that kind of pessimistic way that I said, because they choose to see, I mean, maybe the most tragic death in this story is that the younger brother is this very promising young student who goes to Beijing, which is like a big deal for the first person in their town to have done so. And his death is like is senseless, and they just think of this, oh, this is his curse. But actually, the way it's described, like it's really I don't think that it's not inescapable, it's not unavoidable. I mean, like, he dies because, I mean, like, because his colleagues abandoned him. I mean, he works as a kind of, they're kind of they're trying to kind of, I don't know what the technical term is, I forgot, but they're kind of, the dam is overflowing, and they send a team to kind of plug the gap, and everyone clears off apart from him, and he drowns. But so, I mean, so in that situation, you could look at it as a kind of his tragic fate, or you could say, well, actually, it was very much avoidable if he hadn't been abandoned by, you know, those around him.
I was just thinking, what I was going to say was, I was thinking about Greek tragedy, and Martha Nussbaum says some interesting things about it. I'm not sure if it's her model. Maybe she's sort of developing somebody else. Maybe Hegel. I might be wrong. Please, anybody correct me in the comments on this if I'm wrong. But Nussbaum sort of says tragedy comes from the fact that you have multiple commitments to different people, and sometimes there's no one choice that's not going to hurt somebody else. And she actually makes the argument that it's the good person who feels the tragedy and experiences the tragedy because they take those commitments seriously and make that choice, and something is lost. It seems to be something a bit different is happening in the Unfilial, where there is just this quite brutal abandonment and failure to take responsibility. And it's not one commitment against another. It's just simply an unwillingness to commit to the one thing that one should, whether it's a child or a colleague in the example you just gave. So just throwing that out there as a possible way of thinking about tragedy in this text.
Yes, I mean, it's certainly true that, yeah, that Yao Emei does not shy away from really, really unsatisfactory people. Some of them you have shades of grey, but she can also do some really, really odious people, as in books. And yeah, the way that they really just, their unwillingness to accept even the slightest inconvenience for themselves, the bone selfishness. I deserve whatever it is that I've decided that I want, and I should have no consequences. Those characters are really tough to read about. I mean, and so unsympathetic.
I think, I mean, the boyfriend in Gran is on the way. We just meet a couple of times, don't we? I don't remember a single sort of redeeming characteristic in that character.
It's just awful.
Yeah,
and the cycling in and out of prison, great.
Yeah.
And she's left to pick up the pieces out of this mess that he leaves out of sheer selfishness. Yeah. Unbelievable.
I mean, you're both translators. Let's talk a little bit about translation now. It's, Chinese is a very different language to English. And I guess many of the people listening to this will not speak any Chinese, maybe can't read a single Chinese character. Okay. So Will, could you give us a general sense of some of the challenges and the issues involved in translating Chinese to English?
Sure, I think there are many, but I mean, as you just said, the languages themselves are very different, but I think perhaps the main challenge I find is also bridging the cultural gap between China and the Anglophone world. Not just because this is much wider than it is, say, for French or Spanish, but also because the Chinese language is very rich with cultural and historical references. And I think most of these would go straight over the heads of readers. I mean, often they go straight over my head when I read them for the first time. And this can be like a very alienating experience, I think, if it's too unfamiliar. But then again, if you kind of scrap all these kind of cultural references completely, then you end up kind of, or at least you risk flattening the text and stripping it, what makes it rich and unique. So I always think of the central challenge of translation is, I mean, this is from any language, I guess, but especially from Chinese, is like finding a balance between what's familiar to the reader, but also faithful to the text. And I think that balance is one of the ways in which translation requires a degree of creativity and improvisation. Because I don't think there's any right or wrong way to strike that balance, and it will be different for every translator. So that's kind of my first reaction to the challenges of translating Chinese.
And Olivia, maybe you can expand on that, but let me ask a second follow-up question, which is, of course, Chinese writers are very different in their styles. Is there anything, you know, distinctive about Yao Emei's work that made you think particularly carefully about translating, or any particular sort of aspect of the writing that stood out for you in the process of translation?
I suppose Yao Emei is very psychologically acute as an author, and Chinese language generally is really, really amazingly rich in vocabulary to talk really, really precisely about feeling. And trying to convey the nuance of that is very, very challenging on the basis that European languages just do not have this vast vocabulary for emotion. And to try and get that across to readers, the really, really fine-grained emotional vocabulary that is available for Chinese authors.
I mean, could you, I don't know if this is sort of going to be possible, but could you give a specific example of that? I know you might have to go into Chinese to do it, but could you try to give people a sense? Because, of course, you know, when you're in the fishbowl, it's hard to think outside the fishbowl. If we're in the fishbowl of unfeeling, blunt English, how can we...
but the fact that you can have, you have really precise vocabulary for all the degrees of hatred you feel for a person, and the way that you have vocabulary to talk about different kinds of jealousy, you know,
it sounds useful.
Exactly how aggravated you are, and the degree to which you feel that you can't do anything about it. You know, like I mean, expressions like "不甘心," you know, the this is how it is and I don't like it kind of vocabulary is there in a way that you just, you know, the nuance is really there in the Chinese in a way that is very, very different. Or indeed any European language. So,
I mean, that sounds like it would be frustrating to translate. Is that your experience, or is it rewarding?
I think it's fun, you know, to think of ways to do this that will work well in English. Plus, besides which, I mean, I also do academic translations and translate some really ancient stuff, and that's so much worse. So doing the modern Chinese translations is comparatively much more straightforward and much easier. And apart from anything else, you have real live authors that you can like talk to and ask what they mean, and you know, are they happy with how you've done translation? That's just nice to have that opportunity to double check.
Okay. And Will, was there anything about Yao Emei's style that for you stood out in translating as well?
Yeah, I think there was maybe one technical point and one kind of stylistic point. There are no quotation marks in the Chinese, or at least not in my story. And so in my translation, I mean, I was conscious of the fact that it makes the translation a lot harder because, you know, you don't know who's speaking or who's speaking when, or it's not apparently clear. it's not kind of apparently obvious. So I originally left them out in my translation, but when it came to discussing my story and as a part of a collection with David Lammy, the editor, he felt it was better to be consistent, because I think, I don't know what you did, Olivia, but I think others, at least a couple of others, I think used translation mark, added quotations. And so I completely get that consistency is important in a kind of collection of short stories like this. And as I said, it could get quite confusing not knowing who's speaking. But I actually found, personally, the reason I didn't add quotation marks, I think, firstly, because I thought it was kind of, there must be a reason why Yao Emei didn't use them in the first place. And it felt like I was kind of second guessing her to just take them out, to add them in. And also, I think in the way that you get with, I'm sure there's others, but kind of Cormac McCarthy comes to mind, someone who doesn't use translation marks, and the kind of atmosphere that it creates, just through the kind of slight difference of it, or kind of keeping you on your toes as a reader, because you're not always entirely sure like who's speaking. I mean, it adds something. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but it does add something.
Saramago doesn't use quotation marks either. Makes some of his books very confusing when you're trying to work out who's speaking.
Yeah. So that was the technical point. Also, I don't know whether it was the same in your story, Olivia, but I found, in my story, there was the slightest hint of the supernatural, and when that was introduced, that really kind of kept me on my guard, because as soon as you introduce that kind of that kind of smallest hint, it kind of opens up a whole other realm of interpretation. As soon as the story isn't grounded wholly in realism as it was up to this certain point, yeah, I don't think it would be giving too much work. There's a kind of a curse which we hear about, which is kind of actually linked to the idea of responsibility, or why these bad things keep happening. And the ending is quite inconclusive. It doesn't say, and it was the curse, or it doesn't say like, and the curse was lifted, or it doesn't give you that kind of closure. But yeah, so I thought that was a really interesting element to her work, and one that I'd be interested to know whether it's kind of introduced in other stories as well.
Yes, no, the supernatural thing is there in my story as well, with the gardener who feels the spirits of the aborted children that he's failed to save kind of around him. And that, yeah, I mean, it's kind of not, that it's sort of, is it supernatural? Is this somebody who's actually really psychologically disturbed? I mean, it could be just that, his whole experience as an abandoned child gives him this, who knows? Yeah, it's very ambiguous.
Yeah, and that supernatural element is just another layer to it, which again, I think is not the obvious one that when you first read it, but as you both said, it does open up a slightly other way of reading it, particularly with the ambiguities around certain bits of the style. Well, thank you both for a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion on the Unfilial. Been great to have your insights on the text, but also on the process of translation, which we haven't really done so far on this podcast. So that was great to have. So thank you for the discussion. We will come back for part 3, and we'll hear your recommendations for similar and related texts. So everybody listening and watching, please do join us for that.